Good morning, church family, and welcome to the Sunday school lesson on October the 25th. An equally sincere welcome and shout out to those others who may be watching either now or at a later time. I want to begin today by bragging on the wonderful sermon and singing that occurred last Sunday morning. I thought Mick and Clint both deserve a hearty thank you. I generally try and make it a point on Sunday afternoons to reach out and thank whoever was a part of the lesson, the singing and the lesson. Um, and I just think that's an important thing to do, to say we appreciate what you do, and I encourage others to do the same. And a real big shout out to our new American citizen brother, Alberto de Pena. I've come to know him and Rose just a little bit better through the elder selection process committee. And I have to tell you, I am sure impressed with both of them. So I want to say to that young couple, thank you for all you do for our church. Your faith and efforts bring joy to the heart of this old guy, and you're awful good for the New Braunfels Church of Christ family. Now, there's a cost to doing such work, and investment by them and others should not go unnoticed or unstated. So I also would like to thank Paul Reed for his wise words in the Shepherd's Blessing last week regarding looking ahead to making some godly decisions related to the funds that, Lord willing, will be forthcoming before too long from the land sales. Now, I'm just one of many of the people involved in this rather lengthy and complicated process of this real property transaction, but I can say, at least for me, Paul has been a great resource, a great guide for me in my attempt to help out a little bit with this breakup and liquidation. He's been a terrific light for me, and so I want to thank him as well. Such words of thanks to others go hand in hand with part of my lesson today. And it goes back to the early age training that my parents, and especially my mom, gave to my sister and I. One of the huge determining factors in the course of life and dynamics for my family was the 1952 polio infection that caused my mom to be paralyzed from the neck down for the rest of her life. The 1950s, there was an outbreak, lots of places, but certainly in South Texas, and she was one of those affected. Big old strong farm girl, pretty good size, and she was reduced to where she could paralyzed, where all she could move was her neck without aid. And so I was only 1 year old when she got sick, and my sister was a very big surprise 3 years after she got sick. So we kind of grew up never really knowing until much later in life that our wheelchair mom was anything particularly abnormal. It certainly never did cost my family, and especially my dad, a great deal. But as little kids, we simply grew up with it. We didn't know anything. I mention that today only because that dark time also created some wonderful bright spots in our home. Since my mom's mental capacity was in no way diminished from that occurrence, she was able to pour out so much of her time and focus on her children and on our development. One of her many lessons to us is when you see somebody doing something good, be sure and tell them, and then tell others about their good work. Um, it's something I really took to heart, and I've tried to acknowledge the effort that people make. In fact, much to the chagrin sometimes of my children when they were young, especially, I'd embarrass them by talking to a food server as an example and saying, "Are you going to school? And what do you plan to do?" And just offer an encouragement, thank them. And often I'd ask, and still to this day, to ask them or maybe somebody good on the telephone that's giving me customer service. So let me talk to your boss. I want to tell them how good a job you do. And then I have this little spiel where I talk about, which is the truth, being responsible for 950 people in their customer service, and their training and development and correction and support. And I usually tell somebody does a really good job. If everybody was like you, I wouldn't have had a job. I don't apologize for that. I think it's important that as a believer in what we're trying to study here and the life we should try to emulate and follow, that give praise where it's due. You never know. Well, that pat on the back might help somebody. So both my personal and professional friends through the years are Christian. They, some of them, I don't know where it came from, gave me a nickname a long time ago, Doctor Encourager. And some even gave me a little more private nickname. They used to call me Barnabas. Hey, Barney. So I took that as a badge of honor with compliments to my mom and her wisdom in trying to raise a couple of kids in South Texas in the midst of some pretty hard economic and family challenges. We grew up in the time of the 7-year drought in South Texas, and I thought my growing up years that everybody's yard was dead and dying and had cracks in it. And we only had 2 green things in our backyard, and that was a couple of big old pecan trees that are still there to this day. And my dad took a little water on every once in a while just to keep them going. Another thing Mom taught us was to take responsibility for our mistakes. She was very fond of telling us whenever we tried to pass the buck that one finger pointed towards somebody else means 3 more coming back at you. Just as a slight aside, trivial pursuit, but I think interesting, the term pass the buck, I'm led to believe, came from the buck knife. And in the frontier times, when it was your turn to shuffle and deal in a card game, the knife would be pointed to you so they could keep score in terms of whose turn it was. And if you chose not to shuffle and deal, you would pass the buck to another person. So passing the buck was not something Mama thought very good of, and encouraged us not to do it, to stand up and be responsible for our actions. And while I didn't like those words very much as a youngster, undoubtedly they shaped my approach to taking responsibility for my work. I would often tell my bosses, whether in the college business or my real estate practice, give me the job and put a target on my chest. They could usually count on me to hold myself accountable when a mistake was my doing or that of one of the people that I was responsible to oversee. So, following that guideline, I want to apologize for the mishaps that aired during last Sunday's lesson. Now, bloopers on video or on camera have been the norm for a long time. In fact, there's even shows about that. But usually what happens in something like this is that the problems and mistakes are generally edited out and y'all don't ever get to see them. Well, in the case of last week, I failed to alert Victor of a couple of my boo-boos and mistakes on this tape. And so you got to see what I call the raw works of that lesson. So that mistake was 100% on me, and I offer my sincere regrets. I hope it didn't take away from the words about Solomon and how he got where he was in terms of being known to be so wise. I never have been much of a technology person. I much prefer visiting with people face to face. And so when machinery related things go wrong, I get nervous real fast. Now, that wise lady who's tolerated hanging around me for well over 3 decades now, the lady Danelle, she's pointed out that when I start to lick my lips rapidly, that telltale sign is a clear indicator of my nervousness and anxiety. And she went ahead and mentioned to me after that occurrence that that's really helped her through the years in negotiating with me, and whenever we play dominoes or cards or any parlor game, she uses that against me. Like she needs another advantage my negotiation skills with her, that wise farm girl from Oklahoma that she is, generally end up all about the same way. Yes, ma'am, that's just fine. So I don't know. I don't know why she needs another telling sign from you, but my hope is that we didn't mess up your focus and the deserved honor that Solomon got for his reputation as being a wise person. So before we begin this lesson, let's have a word of prayer. God, we come to you today saying thank you for the opportunity to present this class. Thank you for allowing us to live in a place where such an opportunity is not to be taken for granted, because we have so much freedom. And we praise you for the goodness. While not perfect, we praise you for this nation, and we seek your blessings on it. Father, in a time of so much illness and divisiveness, so much contention and fighting, infighting, coupled with disasters like floods and fire, with the disease that runs rampant over this world, we just got to reach out and say, in charge, you got this. Please, please forgive us of the shortcomings, and help us to do better in all that you do. Thank you, and we love you, Father. In God's name, amen. Okay, you may have chosen. So the selection of identifying wise people of the Bible in itself is a topic deserving more time and attention than a single session or two, a single series, and certainly with the speaker of much greater knowledge than yours truly. So, like most important topics, a presenter simply has to make some decisions on certain examples to select and attempt to apply broad scale principles. So kind of like your favorite color or sport or vehicle or anything else where there's multiple options involved, I've selected some wise women to investigate in terms of how they demonstrated their abilities in different times. They had different positions, they had different assets available to them, but they all showed great signs of wisdom. And I recognize that you might have chosen others and they would be just as deserving. So I'm saying feel free to reach out to the ministry leaders and offer to do some lessons on your own picks of wise people from the Bible, or wisdom learned from studying God's Word. I bet ministry leaders would take you up in a heartbeat, whether you offer to do it remotely or face to face. But my calls today are based upon going alphabetically, introducing these ladies, and we'll see how it goes for you. So my first selection is Abigail. Now Abigail's story begins in 1 Samuel chapter 25. After Samuel's death, David went to the wilderness of Paran, P-A-R-A-N. Numbers 10:12 tell us that that's where the children of God spent some time in their 40-year trek. Numbers 13 verses 1 through 3 also record this location. And Genesis 21:21 tells us this is where Hagar and Ishmael resided after they were sent away by Rebekah and Abraham. It's while in this place that Hagar got a wife for her son from Egypt. So here's where we meet Nabal from Maon, M-A-O-N, and Maon is mentioned in First Chronicles and has quite a long history of people and tribes that caused conflict for the folks of Israel. It's bordering town, neighboring town, if you will, kind of New Braunfels, San Marcos, or New Braunfels, Seguin, was Carmel, C-A-R-M-E-L, and that's those are kind of the closest towns to each other that lie east of on the east side of this large area, which is described as a wilderness. Um, Other references to that location call it a wild pasture land. If you were to talk to folks like Bill Glasscock and myself, we would probably describe some of the country that we lived and ranched on, and in his case, West Texas, and mine, South Texas, respectively, as hard country or rough ground. Uh, this biblical area, which still today is used for flocks, pretty much like they were in King David's time, uh, the description would be similar, although I think it may even be tougher than what we experienced in our days. So Nabal, Nabal, whose name means fool, was a descendant of Caleb, and he was described as being harsh and evil in his ways. Now, whether he was named that right off the bat, they might have called him George and changed his mind because of his attitude, or maybe his name was a reflection of how he was at the get-go. But for whatever reason, he's not spoken of in complimentary terms. Now, this is in direct contrast to his wife, Abigail, who's described in verse 3 as a woman of good understanding, and further described as a beautiful woman. Kind of a double compliment to her, and very much the opposite to her husband. Now, I find it noteworthy that her intelligence was mentioned first. One of my mama's sayings to me as a teenager related to the young ladies that I took an interest in was that beauty fades, but brains used properly only get better with time. Uh, I just, you know, Mama tried. That's all I can say. That Merle Haggard song, Mama tried. So, how Nabal got his wealth by hard work or inheritance or whatever manner is not stated, and I don't think it's significant to the story. But we are told that he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. Now, I must acknowledge that I've never raised either one of those animals, but that seems like a pretty large herd. For comparison, we know that Job, who was in his time the richest guy in the country, had 7,000 sheep and goats plus other animals. So I think it's safe to say that Nabal was not some dirt poor, dead broke person in terms of material things. So apparently, David and his 600 men had performed some kind of an uncontracted security guard detail for Nabal's sheep while his flocks and their shepherds were out roaming around. Now, just as a reminder, we're told that David had about 600 men with him. We really don't know how many women and children, but towards the end of this part of the lesson, you're going to see that obviously there were some women there, and David was doing his best to increase the number of those by the multitude of marriages that he had during this period of his life. So, not surprisingly, what could be called another term, Badlands, was a haven for men on the run, or more than just David and his troops. So, reading between the lines, theft, either for food or on a larger scale to sell the herd, very likely could result in the murder of shepherds, and that apparently was not uncommon in that area. So the story tells us that in that setting, starting in verse 4, David sent some of his men to greet Nabal at shearing time and to point out the duties that were performed without a loss of animals or lives for the shepherds or the sheep and goats. Now, I can kind of picture gathering in Brandon vaccinating and culling and shipping times uh, with cattle, and you know that whole process is you put things in one pen and you make it a smaller pen and a smaller pen and a smaller pen, and ultimately as you're culling and sorting, you get things in the crowd chute and you send them into the trucks or trailers or pastures you want to go. Of course, unless you're an Aggie, you try to come in backwards. But uh, this was a time of you know hard work, and all the people were gathered, and it was a stressful period. Get it done, get it fast. This whole idea of one crop income is not foreign to us farm kids, where we might have been lucky to get two crops, you know, two paychecks a year, the, the crop pay and then the cattle pay or livestock pay. And so, stressful time. I'm sure Nabal was busy as could be with that many animals to handle, but the response he showed uh, demonstrated that he was properly named, because he basically told the men that he didn't know nothing about this David guy, and he got no reason to give him any money or anything and go back. Uh, so he sent them back empty-handed. Now, I want to point out that David instructed them how to greet this person respectfully and honorably, and his request was for some animals that they could spare, some of the meat they could spare for a festival. And basically, Nabal not only turned them down, but he did it in a very abusive manner. Now, they go back and report that to David. Now, if you know much about David at all, you stop and think about it. He was a man of what might be called great emotional contrasts. Now, that's a fancy word to say he was a roller coaster kind of a guy. You know, a fierce warrior who could write a beautiful poem or hymns. A guy full of joy and happiness on a mountaintop kind of high. John Denver used to call it Rocky Mountain High. Uh, Singing songs of praise and thanksgiving, and then fell depressed and sad where he felt lower than the snake's belly on the ground. Now, I'm not criticizing David. I'm sure with the stress of trying to take care of all those people in a hard land, and the threat of Saul trying real hard to kill him, sending all kinds of soldiers out on him, mission after mission. That David's concentration and tolerances, maybe you might just call it country, we'd say his fuse was a bit short. So his response back to this insulting rebuke, that's the only word I can think of, the only word I can think of and say on camera, his rebuke been rebuked by Nabal was one that kind of got David's attention, and his response to the response, if you will, was destined to be one of potentially great catastrophe for him and his legacy. You know, he rounded up 400 men with swords to go kill Nabal and all of his male servants. Now, I don't know how many people Nabal had working for him, but it was probably shepherds. You know, they weren't warriors, and so David's taking these mean, hungry, battle-tested warriors and going against, which doesn't hardly seem like a fair fight. And I know for sure it was not a very good public relations act for a guy on the run from a vengeful and powerful king who was dependent upon getting along with people in the other lands. So David was hot, and he was going to teach a lesson. You know, I think pondering that a minute, you know, talks Jesus' idea about turning the other cheek. He turned the other cheek and yelled at his men, "Get ready, we're going. Saddle up, we're going to go have a fight." And you know, these people, they were probably hungry and tired and dirty and hot or cold or both. and they were probably spoiling for a fight. So he wasn't thinking real straight. Abigail, on the other hand, she got word of this and she jumped into action and was very decisive in her actions. I think it's interesting to note that the servants who were, fearful for their own lives, they came to her and didn't go to Nabal because, as one of them explained, uh, he was such a scoundrel, no one would feel safe speaking to him. Even before this event, Abigail clearly was showing some good household management skills by the mere fact that she had enough food in reserve to give a large amount to David, and so she had her servants basically pack it up and head out, go out and give it to him. Now, there's a long list of things that she gave, but I specifically want to point out two of them. I found it very interesting that she gave 200 loaves of bread, but only 2 skins of wine, because she wanted them full, not drunk. Pretty wise woman. Abigail assured her servants that she would be right behind them. And I know my own confidence in my bosses was always higher when I felt like they took the time to say, we trust you, we support you, we got your back, whatever the right term would be, when I was called upon to handle some kind of crisis. And she promised that she'd be following right behind me. So she wasn't sending out these servants to be slaughtered and food given. Uh, she was going to go and present a case to them, but her actions were going to demonstrate her sincerity in seeking a peaceful solution. So she didn't say, stand down, stand by and stand down, I'll get you some groceries. She said, here you go, I'd like you to have these. Now I won't go into all the words, although they're outlined well in the chapter, but they're kind of a combination of apology and an attempt to show that how the wrong actions here could do more harm for David in a violent, negative sort of way, uh, and go against God's longer term plan for him. So that's worth looking at. It's a pretty interesting appeasement appeal based on logic that I respect her for. She basically said, "I'm sorry this happened. I didn't know anything about it, but here's what I'm trying to do as soon as I found out." So the net result of that exchange, in verse 35, we're told that David says, "Go in peace to your home. I've heeded your voice and respect your person." Now, I find it very important, noteworthy, that he focused on her wisdom and she earned his admiration. Not just looking at her for being a beautiful person and the stuff that she brought him, but the manner in which she handled this crisis. So this wise woman saved her husband and male servants by seeking to deflate David's wrath. She didn't take the blame, but she did hold the offering to be representative of a more peaceful way for David getting what he felt he deserved for the services provided. So she's saying, you don't have to do this retaliation to get what you want. Here you go. Show the community that you are wise yourself, sir, by accepting these with my apologies. She just asked him basically to see beyond the present moment of anger and look at the bigger picture. I've observed players and coaches and cowboys and ranch managers and owners and learned scholars and senior administrators all react in the same way to hurtful or negative potential crises, and the ones I've admired the most are the ones that could kind of see past their first blush reaction and take stock of what the bigger thing was. Kind of the idea of winning the battle and losing the war, if you will. So Miss Abigail, with not much time to prep, she didn't have 12 committee meetings and 16 prayer vigils. She just got after it. Uh, and I'm thinking she might have been sighing a pretty big sigh of relief after this was over with. And no doubt she probably wanted very desperately to give old Nabal a piece of her mind. But when she got back home to report all this, she discovered that he was throwing, these are my words now, a post-cheering party. I believe the scripture says, throwing a banquet. And he was already drunk. So she just held her tongue till the morning. I'm thinking maybe the next day that he was kind of headachy and hungover, but his trouble just was a whole lot more than that, because he got some pretty surprising news. Now, my Bible doesn't say if she delivered this information in a calm way, or she gave him both barrels with the shotgun of her uh, disdain and anger. But however it was presented, is not reported. But what is reported is the net result of that information. And it was of such a shock to him that some medical issue ensued, whether stroke, heart attack, who knows. But we know that he basically uh, went into a pretty disabled state and passed away 10 days later. Now, Miss Abigail, she was not someone ordained with power or position. She acted in a responsible and decisive way, using what resources were available to her with apparently not a lot of regard to her own safety. She she showed a powerful concern to her servants and their well-being. We don't know if they had children. She might have been thinking about that. But her actions and words to David were full of wisdom and no doubt inspired by God. This single circumstance that she was thrust into and her response causes me to see her as a woman full of wisdom and worthy of a review in this presentation. We're told at the end of chapter 25 that Abigail becomes David's second wife. And in the same sentence of that verse, we're told that his third wife is Ahinoam, Ahninoam, Ahinoam, I hope that's right, of Jezreel, became his third. If you go back for just a second to last week, David's fourth wife was Haggith, Haggith, and her son Adonijah was the guy that tried to take the throne without David's knowledge. That's where Bathsheba, who was wife number 4, stepped in to assure her son Solomon would be the next heir after David. So that's what I'd like to speak to you about Miss Abigail. Our next role model today was in a different situation. Like Solomon, she was positionally in a place where wisdom and good judgment was expected by not just one household, but an entire nation. And that lady was Deborah. Now, Deborah was the 4th judge of Israel. While not offering sacrifices, Deborah was said to hear the voice of God and then share his word with others. Her name in Hebrew was spelled Devorah, or D apostrophe Vorah. Translated into English, that is B-E-E. And the Hebrews were known as bees because they followed the leader. Because their sting is painful, but their produce is sweet. Kind of like God's corrections and blessings seem to me to provide a clear comparison. The Hebrews and the bees both did things for others. One collecting pollen and nectar, while the Hebrews would attempt to collect mitzvahs, 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 which are good deeds done for others and for religious benefit. Now, bees are a lowly insect, but fiercely loyal to their hive. And God expects us to be humble, but dedicated to helping others and honoring Him. She was the only female prophet and ruler. Samuel was the only male that occupied that position of double appointment. So that made her pretty special. Now, the Hebrew term to describe her is misphat, mispat, which can also be used to judge. There's some discussion on another descriptive term used for her, and it's said that she was a woman of Lappidoth, Lappidoth. That term is kind of like our use of the word Charlotte or Eugene. Charlotte, Texas, or Charlotte as a lady. Eugene, Oregon, or Eugene as a man. So I mention that only in passing because I'm not going to spend any time on whether that was she was the wife of or she came from that place. But Deborah's story can primarily be found in Judges 4 and 5. 5 is sort of a song of praise, and so we're going to concentrate mostly on 4 today. But this story was written around 1050 to 1000 BC in what scholars call the pre-monarch period of God's people. So Deborah was several other things besides the information I've already shared with you. In Judges 4:4, we're told that she sat under the palm of Deborah, located between Bethel and Ramah in the mountains of Ephraim. Now Bethel would become the boundary line between the southern and northern kingdoms later on, and it's where Abraham built an altar to God and was a common setting for God's people to meet at the time of Deborah. The political setting at her time was one of some real interest. We're told in chapter 4 that the people of Israel did evil in the eyes of God after another judge named Ehud, I don't know, died. The people were delivered by God into the hands of Jabin, Jabin, who was the king of Canaan. And his rule was harsh over God's people. For 20 years, bolstered no doubt by his 900 chariots of iron, he ruled very, very harshly, treated them bad. His main general was a fellow named Sierra. Now, God's children complained regularly to Deborah about this, and she called in a fellow named Barak, B-A-R-A-K. Now, I didn't study much about him because today's talk was about the ladies, so I apologize for not having time to crank him in, but I don't know anything about Barak. But she told him to take 10,000 troops and go to Mount Tabor. Now, interestingly, she picked the place, the time, and the number of troops. And Barak said he'd only go if she'd go with him. So, as it's recorded in verse 9, and I'm paraphrasing up front here, she goes, "Okay, Bubba, but you're going to get no honor and glory in this because God is going to deliver Sierra into the hands of a woman." Now, she didn't say into my hands. She said in the hands of a woman. And you got to think about the odds of such a thing happening, that this major general of this powerful king is going to end up in the hands of some undescribed female. And so in short, this whole thing kind of amounts to Deborah initiating a David versus Goliath kind of scenario. But the battle occurred, and God's children routed the other army, and it says it chased them all the way through, so they were all killed. Big surprise, quite an upset. Oh, we forgot God. Wasn't no upset at all. Sierra abandoned his chariot, we're told, and ran to hide in the tent of Heber. Uh, Now, it must have been going pretty bad if he abandoned his chariot and went running to hide. He asked for water, but Herbert's wife, Jael, gave him milk and put a blanket over him. Now, again, I don't know who Herbert was. I'm not chasing that dog. I'm going to stick with the ladies today. So I can tell you that I did chase quite a rabbit tail trying to figure out what milk would or wouldn't do for you as a lady to go to sleep. And my findings were pretty inconclusive. But one thing did stand out, and that was milk, when offered at a room or slightly warmer temperature, when you can find that by warming up the body, it does seem to induce sleep. I don't think jail had a refrigerator back in those times, and I bet the ice chest was plumb full, plumb empty of ice that day. So a glass of warm milk and a blankie did the trick to put Sierra down for a nap, as we're told, uh, because he was exhausted. Now, I bet some of you might be known to like a glass of milk and maybe a couple of Oreo cookies or your favorite, and you take those and add to it your cuddle blanket. You might take a snooze pretty fast yourself. So this little nap ended up becoming permanent, courtesy of a tent peg applied through the temple using a hammer. Now, we're told that Jael did this by herself. So that victory here led to the start of an uprising that ultimately brought Jabin, king of Canaan, to his own destruction. My point in that story about those women kind of running them together was not only did a woman of position and power demonstrate courage and conviction by listening to God and acting on those beliefs, but she did it in a strategic and reasoned manner. She also put a significant male doubter in his place by prophesying the net result of his hesitancy. I would imagine, if we use today's terms, I would imagine that Deborah's political poll ratings went up through the roof after that significant chain of events. But I want to be sure and not forget this other lady and her wisdom and actions. Jael quickly set the table to remove a general who no doubt had made her people's lives more difficult. And she was likewise strategic and quickly developed a plan of action and carried it out. Now, she didn't have 10,000 troops, she just had her. But in my mind, she performed as well as Abigail or Deborah. And I have to wonder if all three of these women might have been nervous about their decisions and actions. I'm reminded of the saying that courage is being afraid and still doing what you should. So we run out of time, but before signing off, I'd like to leave you with these thoughts. Whether in a Sunday morning Bible study or in all our days on earth, let's remember to recognize and honor the big and little actions made by people, regardless of their color, age, gender, or any other factor, except that they put forth an effort to do the right things. Today, we've attempted to highlight three brave and courageous women found in the Bible who demonstrated wisdom while in positions God gave to them. I hope we've done so in a manner that's worthy of their respect, appreciation, and accomplishments. Thank you for your attention today. I hope the lesson was a benefit to you. The month of November will include messages from Jason and Mick with the broad overview series title of Seeking God, Wisdom in God's Word. I'm sure these very knowledgeable men will do a bang-up job with their lessons and take them in an entirely different direction. For now, I will say blessings to all, stay safe, and do some good for others when you can. Bueno, bye.